It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to what is the first colloquium of the year in what are decidedly challenging times. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Department of Cultural Anthropology and the Ethnography Workshop, a humanities lab of the Humanities Unbounded initiative funded by Mellon and housed in the Franklin Institute, Humanities Institute. I'm Ann Allison, and along with my fellow co-directors of the Ethnography Workshop, Emily June Wong in the Music Department, Ralph Lixinger in Cultural Anthropology, Jane Joe, our graduate assistant in Cultural Anthropology, and our 6 grad student fellows, Cody Black, Kate Byrne, Yangping Ni, Shreya Maini, Jake Silver, and Sophia Goodfriend. We have planned today's session to be a confrontation and conversation around the issues plaguing us in the moment, stemming from the long histories of racism, colonialism, and structural violence still with us from the past, and moving towards what remains an uncertain and precarious future. Calling this Whiplash, Anthropology in and of Crisis, we're particularly interested in considering the complexities of our own discipline in perpetuating regimes of inequity, and also what practices and possibilities we could forge amidst the crises of the particular moment to make anthropology speak critically to the times. To this end, we are fortunate to have 2 of the most energetic, innovative, and bold leaders working in the frontier of public, activist, experimental ethnography with us today. As their schedules are incredibly full, and as we've asked them to be willing to bend to our own experimental format today, shortened talks by both of them, followed by 30 minutes of questions posed by our workshop to generate dialogue between them, and then opening the floor to questions from the rest of you. We feel particularly grateful that they can be here at the start of what must be another busy week, and would like to thank them for the gift of their generosity. Yarimar Bonilla, what a pleasure to introduce someone so active across such a diverse terrain. She is, but is hardly only, an accomplished academic, earning her PhD from University of Chicago in 2008. Professor Bonilla has taught at UVA and Rutgers, as now professor in the Department of Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies at Hunter College, and in the PhD program in anthropology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Bridging historical and political anthropology, her work deals with coloniality, historicity, sovereignty, digital, ethnography, racial politics, cartographic representation, and the politics of memory. Her first book, Non-Sovereign Futures, French Caribbean Politics in the Wake of Disenchantment, published by University of Chicago Press in 2015, examines how contemporary activists in the French Caribbean island of Guadeloupe imagine and contest the limits of post-colonial sovereignty. In her second co-edited book, Aftershock of Disaster, Puerto Rico Before and After the Storm, she looks at the back-to-back hurricanes called Maria that hit Puerto Rico in 2017, launching an incredible devastation that also exposed the deep inequities and long histories of dispossession that had already left certain populations disproportionately vulnerable to disaster, what she has called in a recently released essay, the coloniality of disaster. Assembling narratives of Puerto Rican journalists, artists, and activists in this book, considering their response to both the crisis and the traumas produced by the island's longer socio-political history. This is also the subject of her exciting new Vimeo film, Aftershocks of Disaster, as well as what she's continuing to explore in her current book project, for which she was named a 2018 Carnegie Fellow, where she treats both the short-term and long-term histories of disaster in Puerto Rico by regarding colonialism itself as a form of disaster that drives, as she puts it, the need and desire among colonized people to find new ways to be human. Melding in and from her academic work, Yarimar is also a prominent public intellectual and leading voice on Caribbean and Latinx politics. She has her own monthly column in the Puerto Rican newspaper, El Nuevo Dia, and contributes often to US media such as NPR, Democracy Now!, The Nation, and The Washington Post. In addition, Professor Bonilla is a digital warrior, an ethnographic trailblazer. In the work, she does both using and mixing media technologies within social movements, as well as academic practice. She has theorized hashtag usage within the context of Black Lives Matter movement and the semiotics of digital protest in the context of Guadeloupe, and considered, as was of great interest to us in the ethnography workshop, the role played by what she calls fast writing, as well as the importance of turning critique both out to the public and inward to anthropology in, for example, her article called Deprovincializing Trump, Diversing Difference and Unsettling Anthropology. She is currently developing a multimedia political atlas of the Caribbean entitled Visualizing Sovereignty, and is the principal collaborator in the hashtag Puerto Rico syllabus project. Yarimar is currently section editor of public anthropologies for the journal American Anthropologist. Laurence Ralph, and someone as equally and diversely impressive. Earning his PhD in anthropology at University of Chicago in 2010, Laurence Ralph is a professor of anthropology at Princeton, where he also co-directs, along with Aisha Belicio de Jesus, the Center on Transnational Policing, which, perhaps the only center of its kind, brings together scholars at different levels to understand policing in the US and internationally. His first book, published in 2014 by University of Chicago Press, is Renegade Dreams, Living Through Injury in Gangland Chicago, an amazing book, bringing together different strands of drug warfare, mass incarceration, gunshot violence, and disabilities incurred by gang members in the context of Southside Chicago. Stunning for its theoretical and ethnographic interventions around dreaming, disabilities, and inheritance, as in former gang leaders trying to pass on a different inheritance than joining the gang to young men by displaying their own injuries to them. It has won a cascade of prizes, including the C. Wright Mills Award and 3 honorable mentions in anthropological awards, the Gregory Bateson, Victor Turner, and Sharon Stevens. Professor Ralph's second book, also by Chicago, has just come out, The Torture Letters, which delves into the Chicago police torture of 125 African-American men who were tortured by Chicago police officers when held in detention between 1972 and 1991. Prescient, given the explosion today of police violence hitting our streets on almost a daily basis, Professor Ralph looks here at not merely the torture itself, but what sustains and gives rise to it in the openness of the secret surrounding it and the web of racist institutions and mindsets that assigns to Black men a criminality that always already exists, lending them all too ready targets for violence in the way of torture or shootings by police. Using the innovative idiom of letter writing, which he both culls from and shares with focus groups of ordinary Chicagoans, constituting part of his fieldwork. This is also what Laurence stages in the animated film he has both directed and produced, based on the book called The Torture Letters, recently posted at New York Times Op Doc series. In addition to his books and a proliferation of academic publication, Laurence is an active public intellectual, posting on Twitter and other social media platforms on everything from pedagogy and syllabi to Black Lives Matter, defunding the police, and anti-racism. He's also the former editor of Transforming Anthropology, the flagship journal of the Association of Black Anthropologists, and today is the presiding editor of Current Anthropology. So we would like to invite Yarimar to start us off.
I was sorry, actually Laurence and I had talked beforehand and decided that he would start, if that's okay with you guys.
So correction, we will start with Laurence. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. I don't think I'm gonna take the whole 15 minutes. I wanna really hear from the workshop on the issues. But I'll just, I think, kind of fill in the kind of overall trajectory of the way that I see my work to kind of complement what Anne said about my biography. So I think of myself as doing primarily anthropology related to the question of injury. And that stems from my first project, in which I looked at people who had been disabled as a result of gunshot wounds. And what's interesting for me about injury is its transformative potential. And so I try to look at not only the violence that disproportionately impacts particularly Black Americans, but also what it means in the aftermath of the injury. And I think this is where myself and Yarimar have a lot in common, looking at the consequences of injury. And for me, injury is particularly important and specific in the way that it differentiates from just violence itself or something like death, because I think when we think about injury, we have a chance for recovery, we have a chance for repair. So I'm conceptually interested in the idea of repair as well as injury. Uh, and so my approach to kind of studying these questions of injury is to think about, first and foremost, how might my work as an anthropologist reproduce injury in the act of conducting research, and how can I convey um, the politics of repair in the products that I produce as an anthropologist, whether that be an academic article or a book or a film. How does that work to repair the forms of injury that I'm studying and not just represent that injury? And so for me, that's a theoretical question. That's also a methodological question. And it often takes the form of questioning the idea of ethnographic expertise or ethnographic authority, and thinking seriously about where the source of that authority is coming from. And so that has led me throughout my career to do a lot of collaborative projects. And theoretically, it's led me to really think conceptually about how we understand trauma, how do we understand injustice, right? And so in my most recent project, I thought through and created a research project around a decades-long scandal in which hundreds of Chicagoans were tortured while in police custody. And so it's different from, say, my first project or a lot of research projects in that we know the outcome. It's not a debate that these men were tortured. It's not a debate that they suffered tremendously as a result of that suffering. So I think for me, the ethnographic question has to do with, how do I represent torture without reproducing the spectacle of it? And also, where do I stand in relationship to this issue, right? How can one be objective when speaking about torture? What does that mean? What does objectivity mean in that context? I think historically, for a lot of people, what it has meant is that they do an in-depth analysis of the police officers who were the perpetrator of the torture and try to speak to the victims of torture as well. But what that has done is to focus a study on the humanization and the shared humanity of the torturer and the torturer, and kind of equate them and flatten them in the name of a universal humanity, which does violence to the people who have been tortured in my study. So I think for me, it was important to take a stance and think through just the ramifications of torture for the people who live with the history of torture every day. What does that mean? And how can we engage in a dialogue about torture? And this is where the idea of lettering came about. And for me, it was an exchange between community members and myself, excuse me, an exchange between community members and myself, and a teasing out of what torture has meant and what it means today. And the last thing I'll say before I pass it on is that I think this is the power of ethnography in terms of thinking through those empathetic connections and trying to understand what a given subject matter like torture, like disability, means for people, and how we might make sense of the world anew from that new meaning. And this is the kind of interventions that I always try to make as an anthropologist. And the point, I think, is to engage critically with the world around us. And so, you know, I think my research comes together in the figure of Jacob Blake, who was recently paralyzed as a result of police violence. And part of it is because I know what that kind of injury means. I've worked with people who are recovering from that kind of injury and trying to remake their world after having been disabled. But it's also because disability is such a ignored and understudied phenomenon, but is actually more prevalent than the spectacular forms of violence that we fixate on as a public. And so how do we think through those more ordinary forms of violence as a way to reimagine our social world? And I think that's the key question that I'm interested as an anthropologist.
Great, thank you so much, Laurence. Yarimar, would you like to go?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we hear you great.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you to everyone who has joined in, especially on Labor Day. I hope you have your cocktail in hand and are sitting in your shorts in your backyard, trying to make the most of it. So what Laurence and I had talked about was to use this initial time to talk a little bit about the arc of our trajectory. And I guess I wanted to think a little bit about how I became, as Anne said, a digital warrior or whatever, which to me means like just kind of marching to my own drum, really, and doing the kind of projects in the kind of modes that make me happy. And and Anne reminded me that I almost was a grad student at Duke University, but then I went to Chicago to work with Ralph Trio, where I had class with Laurence, or I don't think we had class, but we definitely coincided. And when I was at Chicago, Trio was really influential and on my trajectory. And at first, when I began, I wanted to do my first dissertation project in Puerto Rico, and I wanted to do a kind of very activist-leaning kind of project. And I would show up at Haskell Hall with newsletters from the community that I was working on and stuff, and he would tell me not to do that. And it was really frustrating to me. And he would also say to not work on Puerto Rico. And so but the way he said it was, building on his own trajectory, was that Puerto Rico would be the work of a lifetime, and that I needed to do something else in my graduate career. And so my dissertation, which became my first book, was not about Puerto Rico, although secretly it really was. It was about the French Caribbean and about the questions of sovereignty. And what I wanted to do there was to think about the issues that I was passionate about regarding Puerto Rico, in terms of imperialism, sovereignty, social movements, political imagination, but to try to think about imperialism and sovereignty outside of the US Puerto Rico frame. and thinking about sovereignty in the Caribbean more broadly. And so in the book, I argue that, there are these places like Puerto Rico and Guadeloupe that are thought of as either exceptional or aberrant, but that, because they do not have sovereignty, because they're not politically independent, but that, in fact, they tell us a lot about how sovereignty operates throughout the world and about the challenges of sovereignty and what I describe as non-sovereignty, which is the search for something other than the kind of post-war decolonization project or the Westphalian notion of sovereignty. So I think that throughout my work, no matter what I'm doing, which mode, which medium, and if it's fast or slow or quick, what I'm interested in is trying to think about this kind of sovereignty otherwise and alternatives to sovereignty. So after my first book came out in that time, kind of a little bit rebellious after tenure, I decided to just kind of do whatever I wanted, and that was the best decision I could have made, because I feel like a lot of the work that has really been influential and sparked a lot of interest in the field, and I say this to welcome others, has been the stuff that I've just done out of real intellectual curiosity and not necessarily thinking about there being a kind of clear trajectory, although of course now I see a little bit more of the trajectory. But among that work is, of course, the article I co-wrote with my colleague Jonathan Rosa on #Ferguson, the piece that we also co-wrote about deprovincializing Trump, and these other pieces that I've also written kind of here and there about unsettling sovereignty, quick ethnography. I don't know, I can't remember the title of the classics one, the settling the classics. So throughout those pieces, I've tried to think of different ways of doing different kind of anthropology in different spaces, through different tools, and of how to connect anthropology to the kind of unfolding problems in the world. And so I think one of those first attempts was the #Ferguson piece, which emerged because the AE editor at the time, Angelique Hagerud, she asked me to write just kind of a short commentary. But I was in this, like, I just finished my book and was kind of burnt out on everything else and obsessed with what was happening in Ferguson. And also just getting to know Twitter and kind of really interested in it as a platform. And so it ended up being a real, one of the first articles in AE about Twitter, and that even cited tweets. And there were a lot of debates that had to be had, and you can tell in the footnotes some of that wrestling with the reviewers of the piece, that they weren't even sure if it was ethical to cite a tweet or all these things. So it was a really interesting piece that has really been used broadly, much beyond anthropology, and has kind of taken on a new life now in this post-COVID research moment, when people are trying to think differently about how to use social media for research, and whether a hashtag can become a field site, or what that looks like. In addition to that, I also started doing more multimedia work. I first did this animated film that's does not compare in any way to Laurence's amazing animated film. Mine is more of a time-lapse map, really, to try to think about, and I have an interest in furthering that into a kind of atlas, as opposed to writing a monograph or something. I'm kind of interested in what would it mean to create an atlas as a book project about the Caribbean, and to try to use maps to tell different kinds of stories. And so it's a map that tells the story of sovereignty in the Caribbean. After that, I think in my career, there's definitely been a kind of pre and post Hurricane Maria moment. And when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, I had just started a fellowship in New York at the Russell Sage Foundation, and I had like an outline and everything of this book I was going to write about the statehood movement in Puerto Rico. But then Maria came through, and it just totally turned everything upside down for me. And I also felt like I just couldn't, I couldn't continue my fellowship and write, this book and not deal with what, this major crisis in my society. And so I really poured myself into doing a lot of public scholarship. And part of what was funny was that this was again a moment where I just kind of did what I wanted to do and talked about what I wanted to talk about. and was really thinking about how I was engaging a public, both in the United States and in Puerto Rico. And it was curious, Hurricane Maria hit in September. And then when I went to the AAA in November, so many people came up to me, anthropologists, and said, oh, thank you so much for what you've been writing about Hurricane Maria in the Washington Post, in The Nation, et cetera. And I was like, oh, you read that? Because I had this idea of public scholarship and engaging the public as something different from engaging my peers, which now, I realize now it's ridiculous, but but I feel like at times I forgot that anthropologists are part of the public as well, and that when we're speaking to the public and doing public anthropology, that it's not like we're not talking to our colleagues as well. And so I have found it, really productive to think about, again, these different temporal modes of writing, this kind of slow scholarship and I've now gotten back to my book and about the statehood movement, which is now about, broader questions. But to do that kind of slow, careful research, that requires repeated engagement with folks. It requires thinking about questions over time. It requires a much larger argument than an op-ed piece. But at the same time, I feel like, the kind of mid-tempo work that my colleague Jonathan Rosa and I have done in our writings about Ferguson and Trump, et cetera, where it's not the quick take or the hot take of an op-ed piece, and it brings some of the careful attention of a scholar, but it's also not, the slow pace of academic publishing, with 2 rounds of peer review and copy edits and indexing and all of that, so to kind of think about these different tempo modes, and then so there's the slow, and then there might also be the immediate, which is the Twitter takes, which I've also have discovered as even faster and more immediate than even, writing an op-ed piece. I've noticed that at times, a kind of well thought out Twitter thread can surprisingly have an amazing amount of impact. So that's something that I've been trying to think about more, like how can we use all these different modes and platforms and temporalities, and I think that the new generation is going to be even better at that than I am. So the book that I'm working on now, well, first there was the Aftershocks book, which was after doing, a lot of public scholarship. I organized a conference at Rutgers for the first year anniversary of Maria, and my goal was to really bring voices that are not usually heard in the American Academy or even in English. So I brought a lot of Puerto Rican scholars and activists and artists, and I was really insistent on there being a strong artistic component, because I felt that the part of what the Aftershocks collection shows is the challenges of narration in the wake of disaster. And I felt that a lot of the important work of narrating, documenting, representing what was happening in the wake of Maria was being done, not necessarily by scholars, but by poets and photographers and plastic, artists, visual artists. So that's, the Aftershock book also tries to think differently about what is a disaster and how it's not a singular event, but rather thinking about this kind of ongoing events, and also the sense that I think a lot of people now with COVID can, get their head around, how it's not this kind of onset moment, but also this expectation and uncertainty and this wait for things to resolve themselves, but also a kind of fearful way that something worse is around the corner. So to try to get a sense of that, and kind of the repetitiveness of the shocks and of the violence of the disaster in Puerto Rico. And obviously how so much of the disaster was not the natural disaster of the wind and the rains of Hurricane Maria, but the infrastructural failure, government abandonment, et cetera. And I think, again, with COVID, we can, look at that again, like there are multiple viruses. There's the virus of COVID-19, but there's also, all the disastrous impacts of the lockdown, all the impacts of government decisions or failure to implement policies, et cetera. And so how can we think about those in tandem? And so for my book, the book that I was starting to write when Hurricane Maria arrived, I'm finally getting back to it. The working title is An Unthinkable State, Puerto Rico, USA, and the Politics of Empire. And so in the book, I want to think about the questions of sovereignty in Puerto Rico, look at the statehood movement, which was something that I was really interested in, and thinking about the kind of quagmires of that movement, of what does it mean to try to decolonize through annexation, and what does it also mean for the United States? You know, what is the kind of appropriate mode of decolonization? Is it to, you know, grant independence and let these US citizens secede, even though there are more Puerto Ricans in the United States than on the island? Or is it a kind of incorporation? And if so, what does that mean? Can there be such a thing as a Spanish-speaking Latino state in the US Federation, right? So those questions are still there, but then now the book is also thinking about not just the decolonization, but also, again, sovereignty, and what does it mean in the wake of disaster and in the wake of what now feels almost apocalyptic. And so some of the pieces that I've already started to publish around that have also been looking at, you know, the different sites of imagining the future and how they're connected with alternative conceptions of race, gender, sexuality, and how, you know, this kind of post-apocalyptic moment can bring a lot of the kind of tropes of nation building and the kind of nationalist subject that was produced, nationalist or colonialist subject that was produced by the post-war decolonization project, how all of that might be brought into question in this moment of political and environmental disaster in Puerto Rico and beyond. And so in line with that, I also just recently completed the film that is a companion to the Aftershocks book. And that film started as just a short trailer for the book, but I hired an amazing filmmaker who I really admired his documentary films and short films, and he's the one who really, you know, with his vision and his talent, you know, we worked together and developed these interviews with several of the contributors of the book, and I feel like the video also brings the book up to date, looking at issues in Puerto Rico after the recent earthquakes and COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, and it also tells a longer tale of the efforts at recovery and reimagining Puerto Rico in the wake of its multiple and still ongoing disasters. So I will stop there. Excited to be in conversation.
Thank you both. That was wonderful. You've put a lot on the table, and you both are incredibly active and dynamic, working in the moment and beyond, and you're an incredible inspiration to us all. So coming from the ethnography workshop, we assembled a few questions, and we're going to spend about the next 20-25 minutes. And we don't have to go through them all. We shared them with both Laurence and Yarimar before. And Shreya Maini, one of the fellows, is going to introduce some of these questions. Maybe Shreya, just maybe you could start with question one, and the two of you, however you want to do it. We had hoped that this would generate and stimulate a conversation between the two of you, and however you want to do it. And when you're ready for another question, just let us know. Okay, Shreya.
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Laurence and Yarimar, for your remarks and for all the work you do. The first question we had was, you know, you both work on very current crises, from police torture in Chicago to Hurricane Maria and its aftermath, the election of Trump, and you do so as very public activist anthropologists. But anthropology is also a discipline whose history you critique as complicit with some of the very structural inequalities you uncover in your work. What, if anything, do you find useful in anthropology that you bring to the work that you do on the present moment as political and public intellectuals?
I can start. So, I mean, I think of that question in two ways. One is conceptually, and I think that what anthropology does for me conceptually is to not take for granted the categories that I'm analyzing. I think in a lot of other disciplines, I mean, for me, this was the difference between picking anthropology or sociology. And I think a lot of disciplines, when you take something um, for granted, such as like the category of the gang. In another discipline, the gang is a variable that could be mobilized. So we could say, okay, the gang member is a young person between the ages of 25 or ages of 15 to 25, who's self-identifies with a particular group, what have you. For me, when I study the gang, it's not that cut and dry. I think about it historically. I think about how the category of the gang came into being, uh, what it has meant at different periods of time, and how people grapple with those different understandings of the gang, and how the category itself is something that is highly debated and highly contested and can change and morph at any given moment. And so for me, anthropology allows me that space to think about um, what we even mean when we're speaking of particular terms. And I think that's important for me because so much of Black life is overdetermined. And so how do I roll back that idea of inevitability, of inevitable violence, of the overdetermination of the category itself? And methodologically, I think I've been drawn to anthropology just because of the long-term engagement with particular communities and dwelling and sitting with people over a long period of time and understanding their worldview and their perspective as a way to kind of undermine uh, certain ideas that we take for granted as a society.
Yeah. So for me, I always, my intro 101 class, etc. Like what I always say about anthropology is that it's just, to me, the core essential is that there are other ways of being in the world. And so that, to me, that has two connotations. First, that, that we need to explore the diversity of ways, right? Human diversity, etc. But it also means that the way that we're living now is not necessarily the one that we have to stick to. So I feel like there's a kind of radical potential in anthropology in terms of questioning, what exists and how things are, and whether they can be a different way. So just, the idea that another world is possible and another way of living and being in community, interacting with each other. So I think that in a lot of the spaces that I engage, where usually it's economists or political scientists talking about Puerto Rico's debt, etc., that kind of perspective that moves beyond the simply like pragmatic solutions of what will the bondholders accept, or what has Washington said is possible, instead to move towards what other possibilities can we think beyond the ones on the table, and how there could be other ways of managing debt that doesn't lead to austerity, recovery that doesn't lead to disaster capitalism, etc. I think that viewpoint is really central. The other key tenet for me of anthropology is that anyone can be an expert on their world. I always tell my students that in other disciplines, they sometimes focus on politicians, on the people who will end up on Wikipedia as kind of the history makers, and that anthropologists turn to the folks who won't end up on Wikipedia, but that see them as equally experts in their world, and see that anyone is really able to narrate their world, and that they're all kind of both historical actors and historical narrators, and can also be kind of experts and theorists about their world. And so I think that combination is what I always retain of anthropology, even as I'm very critical of other aspects of it.
Thank you. Our second question kind of has to do with your positionalities vis-a-vis the communities you work with. So Laurence, you speak of letter writing as this third way, a position that kind of joins by flattening the distinction between insider and outsider. And this also operates in the methodological strategies you both adopt of fast writing and like hashtag ethnography, kind of crafting letters that are both culled from and shared with focus groups, but in kind of advocating a hybrid positionality beyond and between insider and outsider. Is this at all akin to what, you know, Malinowski kind of laid out a long time ago? How does it differ from that? And how do each of you involve the communities you're writing about in terms of formation of research questions, information gathering, or co-ownership of data?
You want me to go first, Laurence, just so that
Yeah, you can go
we,
first.
we we mix it up a little bit? So for me, well, first, I don't know what you're thinking about with Malinowski. I would love to know what you've been reading, or what, you know, what how you see the similarities there. For me, you know, I don't engage. I don't not engage. I don't do collaborative anthropology. I would be interested in. I don't discount it, but I don't think I've ever done it. You know, to me, that would require, you know, co-writing a text, and that's something that, or making a movie together or whatever, and that's just something I've never had the opportunity to do, even though I've done other kinds of collaborations. What I worry about that is that, you know, sometimes our interlocutors, they have different audiences and stakes and arguments that they want to make on their own, and so the way that I engage with, you know, the folks that I think with and work with is more about solidarity. So, you know, I talk to them about, you know, what are they producing? Because a lot of the people that I work with are producing their own text, and these own texts can be anything from Facebook posts, you know, to town hall meeting agendas, etc. And so how can I collaborate with them? And I think part of why I have this kind of relationship is, you know, my first book was about a labor union. And when I showed up in Guadeloupe, I said, oh, I want to give back, and what can I do? And I want, you know, I thought that in a kind of social movement model that I should, you know, that I could be making signs, I don't know. But they're like, no, we're good, we're fully staffed. You know, they were a fully staffed labor union that didn't need me to assist, and said that how you help us is by being a scholar. You help us by writing about us, you know, by writing a book about us that gives us a different kind of legibility, right? As a kind of radical labor union that a lot of people critiqued. And so I kind of learned early on to not try to confuse scholarship with politics, and to think about, you know, the ways in which, you know, scholarship is useful as scholarship, and that we don't necessarily have to turn it into a mode of politics, and that politics can be something else. You know, if I want to feel like I'm doing politics, that requires for me to do something other than what I do for my scholarly work, you know. So at least that's how I approach it. But you know, then there are other ways in which I'm in solidarity with the folks that I work with by giving more visibility to what they're doing, helping them find platforms for what they're doing. But I've never felt that, you know, giving them space in my, you know, academic press book is necessarily what they want, you know. But I would not be closed off to doing that.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I agree with that perspective. I think as an anthropologist, particularly in communities where there's been a lot of research and a lot of researchers and a lot of ethnographers, along with that, there's already a critique of ethnography in the environment from people. And so I've always been conscious of like, okay, how do I make myself useful to people? And a lot of times making myself useful is like, okay, hand out flyers, take pictures. It's not like, let's do a joint project together necessarily, you know? Although I think when it comes to the issue of torture, because it was discounted and ignored for so long, um, I had a lot of conversations like the one Yarimar just described about like, okay, as an academic, it would be good to have an academic book on torture, Um, and this is in the context in which other people are also writing books about torture. Victims of police torture writing books, the lawyers who represented them are writing books. And so, you know, I feel like what was most helpful for me in that dialogue, in that burgeoning movement, was to write a book with the tools of anthropology, to speak about it. Uh, but when I think of like the Malinowskian ideal in particular, I think of a particular urge to kind of legitimize anthropology as a science as opposed to other disciplines. And that urge comes with like a kind of rigorous documentation, which also comes with a kind of objectification, um, and a distance to kind of prove that this is a science or something like that. And uh, I think my critique of that has to do with the critique of expertise and authority that we've been talking about. It has to do with like seeing the people who I'm working with in the field as theorists, as people with their own conception of the world that may contradict with my own, and talking about that disjunctures. And so, uh, and also without disdain for people uh, with whom I'm engaging in these research efforts with. And so, um, yeah, that's my approach.
Thank you. And we only have 10 minutes left, right?
Yeah, so Shreya, why don't you choose, unless Laurence and Yarimar, do you have a choice of which question because I don't know if you have the questions in front of you. Shreya, you can choose,
Sure.
maybe 7 or maybe 3B, might be the most, but whatever, your choice.
Actually, a question that I've been thinking about a lot is this question of how anthropology and ethnography can be used to kind of de-exceptionalize instances of heightened attention to these very ongoing experiences of violence and oppression. So my question is, how do we accomplish this without desensitizing white or privileged publics for whom this paradigm shift is most necessary?
So was that one of the questions? How do we?
Question number 5.
Oh, number 5, okay.
And I can put it in the chat as well.
Right. One thing I'll say, my colleague, Greg Beckett, his recent book about, the crisis in Haiti, I think does a really good job of this in terms of, opening up the question of crisis itself, like when does the crisis begin and end? How can we think about the lived experience of crisis? What is a kind of crisis ordinary or, permanent crisis or everyday crisis? And so I think, the way he does that with a kind of almost, a very kind of writerly attention to description, but that's not the kind of gaze of a kind of Goffman-esque or Philippe Bourgois in Search of Respect, kind of sensationalist portrayal of the grit and pathos of certain communities. I think, that kind of attention, I think, is really important. I've not yet done my disaster ethnography. I will be doing that. And so I'm still thinking about what kind of modes of representation will be most useful in terms of challenging the understandings that people have about Puerto Rico's disaster and where it begins, where it ends, whose responsibility it is, how it doesn't begin and end with Trump, for example. And so I think maybe keeping in mind what the preconceptions are of the places that we're writing about, again, how academics, the academy is not separate from the public sphere, and we traffic in the kind of concepts, modes of representation, tropes, stereotypes, that also have a life beyond the academy. So to kind of keep those centered and push back against them in our representations, might be one way.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's one that I try to think through a lot, just because of the fact of what I study, people presume to be exceptional. And on this latest book of torture, I started with the testimony and interviews with people who have been tortured, with police officers at the time who were aware of torture, and torture took place in their precinct, and they had testified about these occurrences. And I asked them not only about these events, but also about who they wanted to know about these issues. And I wanted to speak with the people who they wanted to know about it, and to see if they did know and what they thought about it. And sometimes who they felt like needed to know about these, like the ramifications of torture, were like politicians, but other times there were like students and who might go through the same thing later and might not know, or just other Chicagoans who were maybe white Chicagoans who weren't aware of this, or other people. And I tried to I did conduct focus groups with key constituencies, and speak about some of these issues that were coming up in my interviews and also in testimony. And for me, that's a way to kind of desensationalize it, because the question then becomes, why do people know or perhaps don't know about this history? And if they do know, how are they living with this history of violence? And what are they making of it? And so for me, when I ended up writing about it, it became just writing on different levels, between saying what people told me who may have been victims of police violence, what police officers who were around at the time felt in terms of their own complicity, because they, oftentimes buried their head in the sand and didn't speak on what they knew in their hearts what was going on, and how residents of today's Chicago were processing those historical events. And what we see is that when we have these, blatantly horrific episodes, what we might think of as exceptional, they're tied very much to everyday acts of violence or use of force, more accurately. And so for me, the continuum of force became a really important concept, because people understood that in the blink of an eye, a dirty look from a police officer could escalate very quickly into death. And so that instance that was seen as exceptional was also embedded in everyday encounters with police officers, or sometimes not even encounters with police officers themselves, but encounters with blue lights or encounters with squad cars. It's encounters with the surveillance state that affected the way they navigated the world. And so what I try to present is a kind of larger picture of the consequences of that, and how that and so how an incident can then have kind of long-term ramifications precisely because it embeds itself in the everyday reality of people.
You know, we're almost ready to open up to the floor, and I think we would like to invite those who have questions to contribute to the chat. Shreya, why don't you just ask one more question? I would suggest either 6 or 7. You choose.
Sure. So yeah, let's go with questions. It has to do with anthropology's future. So there have been a lot of calls recently to kind of just burn anthropology down due to its overwrought racism, colonial past, from which it has not really fully extricated itself. It would seem that while critical of anthropology, neither of you totally adhere to burning it down. Rather, as you put, Yarimar, you say that deprovincializing contemporary US articulations of power, decolonizing diversity, and unsettling the colonial logics of the academy might help us to connect two crucial tasks: interrogating longstanding power formations and imagining new worlds. So might you both tell us what new worlds you kind of imagine for yourselves and for the future, and how you see the interrogation of longstanding power formations as essential to this end?
So for me, you know, this question of you know, the future of anthropology, should it burn or not, like what I always say is that I'm just agnostic. Like, I'm gonna keep doing whatever I'm doing. If you call it anthropology, if you call it ethnic studies, Puerto Rican studies, critical analysis, critical theory, digital warriorship, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. So I don't really have an investment in the discipline survival in the sense of, and this, I wrote this in relationship to this post that Marshall Solins had written, where he said, like, where have all the cultures gone, and where have the anthropologists gone, and we're supposed to safeguard this and that. And I think that, you know, as Ralph Trio said, anthropology is what anthropologists do. And so if what anthropologists are doing now is different than what they were doing before, that doesn't concern me so much, because I feel like this is what defines our discipline in this moment. And so, you know, but at the same, so I'm not scared about, you know, holding on to traditions or preserving it. At the same time, I'm also not particularly concerned with tearing it down. I feel like as long as it serves us, you know, it serves us, and that there are lots of ways in which, you know, I also say that I'm not a big fan of thinking about decolonizing it, because I feel like there's no real way to bring it back to a kind of pre-colonial moment, because it is the product of colonialism. So instead, I think about unsettling it, how to shake it up, how to, you know, maybe dislodge it from this kind of colonial roots. And, you know, and I have to say, the more I engage with other disciplines, the more I feel like anthropology is not even the worst of it. You know, hang out with some historians, some economists, some political scientists, you know, that there's a lot of radical potential in anthropology. And, you know, with my colleagues, Mayanti Fernando and Greg Beckett, we've been working on the Trio reader that's going to come out next year with Duke Press. And in it, we think about what Trio had to say about these issues, and why in his last work, he had this essay on a due culture, of bidding goodbye to the culture concept, but he never talked about bidding goodbye to anthropology. You know, because, you know, and this is something that as his students, we struggled with in thinking about, well, why not? And why does he see so much potential in the discipline? And, you know, the potential that we see is not necessarily the same that he saw. And we talk about this in the introduction to the volume. But, you know, he thought that in lots of ways, you know, anthropology was kind of like the best bet within the Western disciplines. And he particularly liked its kind of openness to non-Western standards of evidence. The fact that a folktale could be a site of evidence, whereas for a historian, it has to be something in an archive, right? So I think that there's a lot of potential there, and that as long as that potential and those models continue to serve us, we should continue using it, but at the same time, we have to be really critical of it. And as my colleague, my auntie Fernando, she's written about the importance of in disentangling the object of observation and the object of study, for example, to think more critically about, what is it that we're trying to say, not just what are we looking at. We're not just documenting cultures and for a kind of catalog or a World's Fair. There are arguments that we are making about the world, and if we're making those arguments, let's be more transparent about them. And so to think about, how we can do that and call it anthropology, call it, anthropology of the future, anthropology otherwise, or call it something else, to me, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think, as I mentioned before, anthropology has provided me with certain critical tools that I didn't find in other disciplines. And I find those tools useful. Now, I think there's a question of whether one needs to reproduce what has been the canon in order to teach those tools. And I'm not sure you do have to do that. And so for me, the question of do we burn down anthropology has to do with what do we imagine in its wake? It's not separate, because I don't think anybody's saying just burn it down and nothing and just walk away. I think, in tandem with the destruction is an imagination of what one has to create. So I think that I'm on board with envisioning what one can create in the wake of the reproduction of a canon that we know is problematic on various fronts. But I think burning it down could have different implications for different people. I think there's a undercommons reading of that, which is that the critical scholars, the subversive scholars relationship to academia should be one of just taking what you could get and making a livelihood out of that, and a fugitivity following Moulton and Harney. Or what I'm speaking of is a more abolitionist orientation, where it's not just you believe that such a institutional structure like the police or the prison shouldn't exist, but you also believe that the resources that we dedicate to that institution should be reallocated in a more productive way, and that we are using it to transform collectively. And so I'm more on board with the collective transformation of institutional structures rather than just just a fugitive existence, I would say.
Thank you so much. And Shreya, thank you so much for posing the questions from the ethnography workshop. So now we've opened it up to the floor, and we actually have two questions. And I think I'll just read the two questions. So we have about 20 minutes left. So I'll read both of the questions and maybe let you answer both of them. I mean, they kind of speak to one another. The first is from Sarah Molinari. She asks, how has the pandemic changed? How might you approach teaching a course on ethnographic methods post-COVID? I imagine that she's also asking, how do we do ethnography in COVID times? A question that a lot of our grad students and ourselves are struggling with. And also, how is COVID impacting your current projects? The second question is from Louise Menkes. She says, I'm interested in the limits of experimental experimentalism for you as anthropologists. Could you talk about moments when you have pulled back from risks you thought about taking in your research or from adopting particular modes of representation?
Well, I'll speak to the first one about COVID. So I'm lucky in the sense that I was mid-project. So I have this database of you know, I've been doing the survey research and focus groups and stuff in Puerto Rico about first Hurricane Maria, then the earthquakes, then, you know, all these different crises. And so I've been doing phone interviews with these folks. And so I'm lucky that there were folks that I had already met before, etc. And so, but I've also been doing some phone interviews with folks that I didn't know as well. And I have found the phone interviews to be really generative. I like them more than a Zoom call, actually, because first, I don't have to perform any smile or nodding or anything. I can just really kind of focus on what they're saying. And I can also take a lot of notes and you know, usually when I conduct an interview, there's a lot of emotional labor in kind of responding and creating a safe environment. I think for the person on the other line, it's also very comforting to be outside of the ethnographic gaze. You know, they can cry if they want to. They can, you know, not fix their hair or whatever, not care about how they look. And so I have found them to be really interesting, and it's made me want to think more about, for example, why in psychoanalysis there's the therapist couch where you're not facing the therapist, etc., and you know how that might, you know, kind of lead to different kind of ethnographic conversation. The other thing is I'm working on a podcast I'm doing an episode of an NPR podcast, and I've done in-person interviews for that. I put on a mask, the other person puts on a mask. We do the interview outside, on, you know, in open air. There's obviously some risks in that, but you know, I've been very, very careful. Otherwise, I barely leave my house. And so I've decided to, you know, to try to work around that, you know, and if the other person is willing as well, and you know, I'm trying to go to this archive to look at some stuff, and I said I'd be willing to do a COVID test before going. So I think, you know, we're all trying to figure it out in this moment, but I'm trying to do work, although at the same time I'm trying to say this repeatedly everywhere I speak about this stuff, that both in terms of long distance and remote teaching and long distance and remote research, I think we need to distinguish between that and emergency teaching, crisis teaching, emergency research. And so to not feel that we have to continue producing, and especially on Labor Day, and that we can't pause. I think it's important to also take stock, you know, and I learned this with the Haitian earthquake. When that happened, I worked with a collective at UVA called the Magnitude Collective, and I made these remarks at the time about how, you know, what I learned from that group was to let the magnitude of the event impact us, to not just go on as usual, and to really just let the feelings, you know, and experience that. And so I applied that lesson to Hurricane Maria as well. Like, I was not gonna go carry on with my work as usual. I was going to let the world impact me. And so I think in this moment too, like, we can't be these like professorial robots and research robots. Like, we have to be in conversation with the world and in the reality of what's happening in universities and you know, hiring committees, and everyone is going to have to take account of this moment, and there has to be a dip in productivity. So I say that even at the same time that I do think, you know, we have the work that we want to do, and to document this moment is also really important.
Yeah. I have to teach a methods class in the spring, so I'm thinking about this. I don't know what I'm gonna do yet to meet the challenges of the moment. But I do agree with that last point about taking stock, and I mean that quite literally. I think there's a question of like, how much more research do we need on certain things? Like, or do we need research on that thing in the way that we think we need it? Like, do we need another person to go to the same space and ask similar questions, or can there be a way to do it differently? Like, are there archives we can look at to ask similar questions? Can we collaborate with other people who have, you know, done similar things? In other words, I don't think that there's a scarcity of research that's already been done. I think, you know, if anything, we have this kind of, like, in the name of productivity, we feel like there's certain ways to be productive, and that's a particular mode of engagement and doing research that imagines itself to be creating something anew each time. And I think that we really have to question that. And like, now is as good a time as any to question that presumption and really think about what's been done already and why, and what new questions we can ask about things that exist in the world already. And can we cross the boundaries between museum studies and archaeology and biological anthropology in a way that's productive and speaks to the present moment? And because I think that it's a mistake to think that this is just an exceptional event and then we'll go back to normal. You know, it's like, this to some extent will be the new normal. So how do we think about how to conduct research if this is the new normal, if this is the way, a new way of orientation, if sociality looks fundamentally different? I think those are, you know, all questions that should be on the table now.
If I can just add, I think that's such a great point. I participated in the Stanford seminar on social research, and someone asked, you know, I don't know how to interview homeless folks right now. And I said, well, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you don't need to, you know? And I think, like Laurence, like you're saying, like, maybe there's already work that's been done about that. Maybe you can do that in a different way. And I think, again, that gets back to this idea of separating the object of observation and the object of analysis. I mean, there are ways that you can write about the problem of homelessness without interviewing a homeless person, right? And that you can, you know, produce important political work that can impact policy or that can help us rethink things, you know. And I think that, you know, that's been one of the problems with anthropology too, is the conflation of anthropology and ethnography. I mean, not everything has to be ethnographic for it to be anthropological. And this might be a great time for the discipline to think more about what is an anthropological perspective, not just what's ethnography, right?
Thank you. And all of us feel like we're asking the same questions. I mean, the relationship between ethnography and anthropology, and what is the moment and what is the future. And I agree, Laurence, this is the new normal. I don't think this is anything exceptional. We have 3 questions, and I think I'll ask 2 of them. One is from Joe Hiller. Thanks so much to you both. My question is about the role of anthropologists working on the aftermaths of violence, and whether you see promise or peril in justice system type responses, whether through the International Criminal Court or maybe a Truth Commission or some other structure of reparations or redress. Are these useful for the collective transformation of structures, do you think? How does scholarship intersect with official justice and punishment systems in the US or internationally? And I'm going to pair that with a question that Ralph has asked. What about anthropology as a practice of surveillance, and the complex history of anthropology and working with counterinsurgency movements from Latin America to Southeast Asia to Afghanistan, and in the US as well? How with protests in the street, political violence from Hong Kong to Portland to Kenosha, surveillance is happening at every event. In this context, big tech, the architects of this new surveillance regime, have made billions in the COVID moment. And but they are donating hugely to BLM and other movements. How do you see anthropologists best intervening, both in surveillance capitalism and in the corporate appropriation of BLM?
Yeah, I mean, I could start with some of those questions. I think I haven't seen a kind of system of repair that is without like major critique. And I think that's because even in like in the context that I study in Chicago, the reparations ordinance, it was groundbreaking in the amount of collective resources it gave for Chicagoans, everything from education to jobs to counseling to curricula development about the history of police violence and the history of police torture specifically. And these are collective things that benefit the entire community. But the fundamental issue is that it doesn't ask anything of the police itself. And so I think part of the repair has to be a kind of fundamental institutional transformation of the institutions that have historically produced harm. And what I'm seeing in these large scale initiatives is not that. So I think it has to be paired with a kind of abolitionist reimagining in order for it to be true to its word in terms of repair. Or else the question of what is to prevent it from happening again has always seemed not sufficiently answered to me. And so I think the role of anthropology has to do with pointing these things out. It has to do with finding solidarities of communities and groups that have been harmed, which takes us to surveillance and takes us to the protests. And I think that, yes, I think there's an opportunity that people are seeing in terms of, even I think there's a backlash to BLM now based on the gains that it made earlier in the summer, where Black Lives Matter, like you can see the tangible gains in the public consciousness from 2014 to 2020, and just the ability to add a new set of items to the public lexicon, such as abolition, and be openly debating abolition on the New York Times, for example, is, that would be unimaginable even a couple months ago if you asked me if that could happen. And so I think there is a kind of visibility that all these protests around the world are allowing through social media. But yes, I think there's that also the contradiction. And I think that there are a couple of issues that need to be teased out. Like, I think the idea that like Twitter and all these different social, big data technology corporations are trying to cleanse themselves through philanthropy isn't new. I mean, that's the function of philanthropy. I think the issue is that like, even if they are contributing to anti-racism or what have you, I think it's important to point out the contradiction that Ralph mentions, but also the fact that this is always a problem with philanthropy, in that, you have an outsized group of people influencing what the solution will look like. Now, whether that's the solution to policing, whether that's the solution to education with Bill Gates or somebody like that, or whether that's the solution to natural disasters. Having a few people, a few millionaires, even if they're well-intentioned millionaires, determining what that will be through their investments is problematic. I think we have to think about a way that our collective resources might be put to better use. And I think that those conversations, again, are already taking place, but we can't erase them through philanthropy, and we can't act as if it's the same thing, right? even if they use the same language, even if they co-opt the same movements.
I don't have a lot much more to add from what Lauren said. I agree with all of it. You know, just the last part about this philanthropy. It's interesting. In Puerto Rico, there's been this move to create more tax breaks for high earning individuals to move to Puerto Rico, and that's something that I've been writing about, and how these folks are interested in, and they're the folks for whom a non-sovereign place works the best, because they benefit from a fragile state. They benefit from this public disinvestment, because, you know, they live in their compounds, they have their power supplies and water cisterns, and you know, they don't need working public infrastructure like the rest of society does. And they are, you know, they have this firm belief that they, you know, they don't want to put their money into the public coffers. They want to choose, you know, what charities they support, etc. And they're often charities that don't necessarily serve folks in Puerto Rico. They're obsessed with stray dogs, for example, and stuff of that nature. So I think that, yeah, we have to think very critically about the role of the philanthropic industrial complex. But, you know, at the same time, I agree, you know, with what Laurence is saying. Like, we're in a moment where, thankfully, you know, there are things being debated in the mainstream that would have once been really on the margins and at the extremes.
You know, we only have a few minutes left, so maybe two quick questions. One from Diane Nelson: how did you both do your you know, the animated film, Laurence, and then your movies, and the one most recently, Yarimar? I think, Laurence, didn't you direct and produce yours yourself?
Yeah.
And Yarimar, you found someone. So she's interested in that process. And then there's a question by Mary Ebeling, more about being in the university as academics. Following up on your discussion about, do we need more research, and connecting it to your ideas about abolition anthropology? If we are to change the institution, how do we resist the demands of the institution to always produce, to be a productive subject of academic capitalism? And also, yeah, I mean, we're all here within an academic institution, and of course, this is something as anthropologists and other academicians, we think about what is the future also of the academy and being in the academy. So both your movie making, and then how do we locate and resist along the lines that you have put out so beautifully today within the academy.
Yeah,
go ahead, Laurence.
Well, just in terms of my film, I got a grant, and so I basically wrote the script, and then I had to go about just finding an illustrator that I resonated with and a composer that I resonated with. But I would just like to say that, to me, this was a collaborative process, and my main goal was, like, I knew that there were a lot of things about torture that exceeded what I was able to write about. And so what I wanted to do through animation, and through an abstract kind of animation, is just convey, like, emotion. And some of, like, the most theoretically powerful conversations I had were about that translation process of, like, what it meant to articulate grief visually and sonically. And it was, like, a really great experience for me, just to be able to have those conversations with people who thought about that for a living. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we need to collaborate more, I feel like, as academics and as anthropologists, to kind of address certain publics. I think my perspective was similar to what Yarimar said earlier about, like, just allowing for what drives me to anchor my professional interventions. And I think when I think it's very common for people of color, but maybe for everybody. I don't know, like I didn't know of anthropology really until I got into graduate school. I didn't know the history of the discipline. I didn't really know the major figures. I didn't have anthropology even as an undergrad major. But I had social problems that I was interested in addressing. And the books that I read, it seemed like anthropologists were addressing that in a way that resonated with me just because of the deep and intimate connections and the um, attunement to empathy. And so I was drawn to the discipline in that way. And I think um, I'm still interested in those projects. And I think whatever I do professionally, I'll be I'll be doing those things. But if for some reason anthropology just rejected me and didn't want to hear my voice on those things, I wouldn't be beholden to being an anthropologist. I would be beholden to addressing these social issues that I care deeply about. And I think it's hard for me to imagine a different orientation. I know people have different orientations because I speak with them often about, how to approach a research topic and what have you. But I think that for me, first and foremost, it's always been about how to turn a critical eye to these systemic problems that are happening in anthropology or in the world. And I think anthropology provides very useful tools of doing that. And so that's what I'm interested in, using those tools as an anthropologist, because there's things that I can say that I don't believe I could say if I was trained in a different way. And there's insights that I have that I don't believe I could have if I didn't have the experience that I did have through the.
For me, in terms of the movie, it all started because I was doing a lot of book events for the Aftershocks book, and I just got tired of repeating my same spiel over and over again. And also, since it was an edited book, it was how to approach it, to do a reading or whatever. And so I asked this filmmaker, who's a friend, if he would do a short video that I could play at the beginning of the book events. And so he's like, okay, well, let's pick a scholar from each part of the book and interview them, and you can play that at the video event. But then it was originally going to be like 2 or 3 minutes, but then we're like, okay, well, let's do something more substantive, like 8 minutes. And then, but we did these interviews and they were all really amazing. And, we ended up with this, but we did it pretty quickly. And part of what I really enjoyed working with him is that although he does documentary films, he's worked in television a lot. He used to work for Democracy Now! And so he's very quick and is very good at editing down, things very, very well. And so I wrote the script in terms of the parts that I said, with the beginning and the end, the voiceovers. But the rest of it was not scripted. He directed it. It was his artistic vision of, what to shoot, whatever. I felt like when we were filming that I was just like the on-camera talent, like the host or something. We did, some of the editing was collaborative. And I learned so much, and I'm still learning from him a lot as we distribute the film, etc. But to me, I felt like I didn't want to spend time figuring out how to make and edit a film when there were people who do it, for a living and do it so well. And so I would rather pay him, and I also got a small grant from Hunter College to do that.
So, we've reached our time. And if you were here with us physically, this is when we would say, please join me in thanking these wonderful speakers. So, so just a virtual clap to you both. This has been wonderfully energizing, dynamic, everything that we hope for and beyond. So thank you both. Continue in your work, and we hope that everyone stays safe and on the lines. So thank you all. Please take care. Okay.
Bye. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Thanks.